Hello YouTubers, this is Jerry at the movies, and last week I did a two-part episode on Hollywood remakes, which inevitably I'll return to because there are always remakes being made, and maybe movies that shouldn't be remade in the first place. But this week I'm going to review two films, 1981's The Legend of the Lone Ranger, and 1982's, because I think it came out in December of 82, although I thought it was 83, Time Rider, The Adventure of Lyle Swan. Why review 80s flicks? I don't know, I guess because I was a teenager during that time, and there were some films during the 80s that I had not seen. Space Hunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone with Molly Ringwald and Peter Strauss, to name one, and there are several others. But Legend of the Lone Ranger I'd always been curious about, and so I finally did get around to seeing it. And all I could say is it's a rather mediocre and half-hearted attempt at reviving the legend of the Lone Ranger, quite literally. Klinton-Spilsbury plays John Reed, who in this case, in this adaptation of the story, is an attorney, and he returns to the town of Del Rio to help his brother, a Texas Ranger played by John Bonnet Perry, to deal with a notorious and evil Butch-Cavendish played by Christopher-Lloyd. So it looks like everything is pretty much set in place for this type of story, except that when they get together and confront Cavendish, a massacre ensues, and John Reed is the only one that survives, although he's left for dead by the Cavendish gang, and he is essentially rescued by Tonto, in this film played by Michael Horse. And Tonto had known the Lone Ranger, or John Reed I guess I should say, from way back in his childhood when John Reed's parents were killed by the Cavendish gang. So naturally this is almost like a revenge story. And since John Reed and his brother are aware of what Cavendish gang have done, and thus now have killed John Reed's brother, John Reed learns to use silver because it's pure, and somehow gains the ability for gunfighting skills. In other words, he learns how to use a gun thanks to Tonto. That's kind of a departure from the original story of the Lone Ranger, because in the original story, in the radio, which started out in radio, and the TV serials with Clayton-Moore, the Lone Ranger's already a Texas Ranger before he becomes a Lone Ranger, and already knows how to use a gun. So, the story here is completely different in that respect. And before you know, John Reed puts on the black mask, and hi-yo silver, here we go, and he rides his horse and joins forces with Tonto to stop the Cavendish, or Butch-Cavendish, from kidnapping President Ulysses-S-Grant, who is going to be riding on a train near the town of Del Rio. And anyway, that seems to be part of the story. It's a little bit convoluted, I thought, and anyway, Ulysses-S-Grant is played by the late Jason Robards. Problem with this film is Klinton-Spilsbury, who plays John Reed, aka the Lone Ranger, never did another film since this. In fact, this is his singular film. It is The Legend of the Lone Ranger. And he doesn't have much presence, and I guess it doesn't help that his voice is dubbed by James Keach, so you don't get to hear his voice. Or his real voice, whatever Klinton-Spilsbury really sounds like, which I haven't the faintest idea. I guess there wasn't much trust in his voice. Anyway, there are a couple of things that do work. I mean, some of the shootouts are, technically well done, and it does have the feel of a Western, but not the spirit or adventure, I would think, associated with something like the Lone Ranger. When I think Lone Ranger, I think the William Tell Overture and Clayton-Moore, who played the Lone Ranger for a long time in his career. In fact, that was his role. He iconicized it. And, you think of adventure and action and a good sense of spirit and a true hero. And in this film, it's all rather listless. and so is, in fact, Spilsbury. He's just not the most compelling hero, not the most compelling presence. Christopher-Lloyd has his moments. Jason Robards is interesting, to say the least, is watchable always. I mean, he's a watchable actor no matter what he does. But again, it's kind of a mediocre movie. It doesn't really resonate. It doesn't lift you up from your seats. And it's interesting that this came out the same year as Raiders of the Lost Ark. And guess which movie is better? Which one has the spirit of the serials of the past and intensifies it and brings it to the modern era? It's Raiders of the Lost Ark, not Legend of the Lone Ranger. Two things that I found of interest in Lone Ranger. One is Christopher-Lloyd has a scene where he presents a mock-up of a train track route, of which basically sets this up with his gang where they're going to kidnap Ulysses-S-Grant. Again, I don't remember the reason why they were going to do this. I don't really care. But they establish all that in a mock-up. Now this is set in the Old West in, I don't recall the year, but let's just say in the late 1800s. And what's fascinating about that is that Christopher-Lloyd, of course, who's known for doing other westerns, including Going South, which was a comedy with Jack Nicholson and Mary Steenburgen from 1978, but also Back to the Future Part 3, which is set in the Old West, and as you recall, his character Doc Brown goes back to the West and finds that that's where he wants to retire, and Marty comes back to rescue him. Anyway, there's a scene in Back to the Future Part 3, which also stars Mary Steenburgen, by the way, and he has also a little mock-up of how they're going to push a DeLorean up to 88 miles per hour on these train tracks, using a train, of course, to push it. And so that's one thing of interest. Another critic online brought up a good point, which is that I used to have the Lone Ranger action figure. I don't know if I had Butch-Cavendish, but I did have the Lone Ranger and Tonto. And this was a, I think, Kenner toy line developed based on the likenesses of the actors in Legend of the Lone Ranger. So what's interesting is there's never been a Back to the Future action figure lineup. And so Christopher-Lloyd has the distinction of having only one action figure based on a character who's less than memorable, Butch-Cavendish. Anyway, cinematography is by Laszlo Kovacs, who also photographed Easy Rider, but it has kind of a washed-out look. I expect sharper, brighter colors for something like the Lone Ranger. But the other thing of interest is the fact that I know the editor of this film, Thomas Stanford. I always called him Sir Thomas Stanford, and he had won an Oscar for editing West Side Story. And he's worked on other films. He edited Split Decisions, which he actually was fired and replaced. But he had done other films. He had edited other films. And I met Thomas Stanford in New Mexico when I lived there in Santa Fe. I worked at the KSFR radio station, and he was working there. So he was retired. He told me some interesting stories. But I didn't know he edited Lone Ranger or hadn't remembered until I saw the film. But even so, the film's pacing is rather off. So sorry, Mr. Stanford, but there you have it.